This is episode 4.1 on the end of the Cold War. There are three major themes in this chapter: the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and finally the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Let's start with the end of the Cold War by looking at past O-level questions. Last year, the given factor was the inability of the Soviet Union to control the Warsaw Pact. In 2019, the focus was the weakness of the Soviet economy. And in 2016, the question centered on Gorbachev. For today's video, we will primarily focus on the weakness of the Soviet economy. Over the years, I've noticed that when students attempt these questions, they often make a common mistake. Notice how here the argument jumps straight from economic weakness to collapse of the Soviet Union to end of the Cold War. It doesn't explain why the Cold War itself ended, only that the Soviet Union disappeared. This is superficial because it confuses the cause of Soviet collapse with the cause of the Cold War ending. In this next example, we once again see that the argument links internal Soviet reforms to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Yet again, this is too simplistic. It doesn't show how these reforms influence the international tensions and rivalry between East and West that defined the Cold War. Here's a list of things that define the Cold War. Let's look at the external burdens that weakened the Soviet economy. The Soviets poured huge amounts of money, equipment, and supplies into supporting its communist allies around the world. One example was the war in Afghanistan. Soviet troops intervened to help the pro-Soviet government stay in power, but got stuck fighting the Mujahideen, who knew the terrain well and were backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, draining Soviet resources, manpower, and morale. It showed that the Soviets were overstretched by its global commitments. On top of that, the arms race with the United States was incredibly costly, as both sides tried to maintain nuclear parity. All these external pressures strained the Soviet economy and made it harder to sustain the Cold War. Let's use this new information to improve the previous paragraph. We know the Soviet economy was collapsing under its own weight. They were also pouring money into costly proxy wars like Afghanistan. By the time Gorbachev took power, the economy was too weak to sustain Cold War competition, and that's why he turned to reform and cooperation, moves that ultimately helped bring the Cold War to an end. This is the end of the episode. In the next one, we will explore other factors that led to the end of the Cold War.